Welcome to Chapter 5, Nonverbal Communication. Let's start off with a brain refresh and to think about language. So remember that language is abstract. So tell me, what are the 4 steps in the abstracting process of language? Remember that this is information that should be in your notes. And off the top of your head, you should be able to tell me that language is abstract and what and what. If it helps, you can think about the fact that language is comprised of symbols. As we talk about Chapter 5 in nonverbal communication, here are Wood's focus questions. What is nonverbal communication? What types of nonverbal behaviors have been identified by scholars? How does nonverbal communication express cultural values? And how can you improve your effectiveness in using and interpreting nonverbal communication? So I want you to take a minute, pause the recording, look around, and tell me what nonverbal communication do you see going on around you. Make notes. Right, so I've mentioned several times that examples are the best way to remember these concepts because the point here is how do we apply what we're talking about. So take a look at the clothes and the folks around you, the way the room is arranged, the volume, what do you hear, right? So all of these different pieces. And try and think about what it means. So perhaps you're in a coffee shop, perhaps you're in your living room, maybe you're in some other random destination. What about that location speaks to you? What do you learn about the other people or about the place based on what you see and hear and smell and feel? So for example, when we think about classrooms, there's very different types of classrooms. You can see here some examples of uniforms or not, right? How desks are arranged, what people are wearing in the classroom, how people are interacting with one another, raised hands versus just open group conversation, what they have with them, right? So we see a stadium seating on the far right. We see a very bare, simple classroom in the middle, students in uniform. And we see what looks like a far more laid-back atmosphere on the left. And we can gauge those things based on what people are wearing, how they're wearing them, and what visible nonverbals that we see, including the layout of the room itself. So what is nonverbal communication? It is communication that does not use words, either written or spoken, but it does interact with verbal communication, and that's crucial. These are not two very separate, they are very often entwined. Not always, but very often. Nonverbal communication is multi-channel, meaning we see it or hear it or feel it, right? All of these things at once, and so we're getting these messages in multiple ways. And it counts as nonverbal communication if it's being interpreted as a message by the sender or the receiver, sometimes both. But often when we send a message and people are picking up on, oh, this person's so tired, that's potentially not a message we meant to send. But because it was interpreted as one by the receiver, it does count as nonverbal communication. It's important to note that nonverbal communication is generally more ambiguous than verbal. This is because often culturally we have assigned meaning to symbols, which are words, but the symbols such as a shrug or a facial expression or a hand gesture can be far more ambiguous than those words that are more easily defined by the dictionary. So we have different types of communication, of nonverbal communication, and so I mentioned that it counts if it was received as a message, interpreted as a message by either the sender or the receiver or both. So if you think about which is spontaneous and which is symbolic, which of these examples, right, is more symbolic? And what that means is there are actions going on that have been culturally assigned to have meaning. So for instance, in the classroom setting, the symbolic pieces, we see a teacher, and we see it as a teacher compared to students because of where she's standing, because of the ages of the people. We guess this is a classroom because of artifacts that show up. A student raising their hand is very symbolic. It looks like the students here are likely wearing uniform, also very symbolic. If you look on the right, I very specifically am talking about where that yellow arrow is pointing. Does he count as spontaneous or symbolic communication? And I'm going to say that it is spontaneous. I highly doubt that he intended for that face to show up all over the interwebs. There are, however, images within this that are also symbolic. So, for instance, a baseball uniform, the crowd wearing particular clothing, are symbolic meaning messages they meant to send. This guy, on the other hand, not so much. Very spontaneous, right? But we still get a message of abject fear and concern, even if it's not what he necessarily kind of intended and thought about sending. So there are three functions of nonverbal communication. These are things that nonverbal communication does. And so the first we'll talk about is that it expresses meaning. And so three different types of meaning. Responsiveness to one another, or lack thereof, whether we like someone or not. And we also use it to display power. Right? So maybe through what we wear and how we speak and who we touch and how. So here we see some guys, they seem to like each other, right? They seem like they're friends, they're very responsive to one another, so we have meaning going on. Here we have what looks like, they're responding to a greeting. Potentially they like one another. So if we knew more about the situations, we could tell more, have more meaning going on here. It's also possible that this handshake is demonstrating power. I don't know if you've ever come across someone who does the handshake tight grip to try and demonstrate that they're stronger and control the situation. I think it's fading out, but it's unfortunately still common practice among many folks. And if we look at the picture in the bottom right, we can see that there's definitely not liking happening there just based on her facial expression. So the first of the three functions of nonverbal communication is it's meant to express meaning, and we specifically look at the meaning involved with responsiveness, liking, and power. And so take a minute in your notes, pause, and write down some examples for each of these. How in your life have you seen nonverbal express meaning in terms of responsiveness, liking, and power? The second function of nonverbal communication that we'll talk about is that it expresses cultural identity. And we've already seen this come up in numerous ways, but this is very explicitly listed as one of the functions of nonverbal. So for instance, greetings, very culturally based, right? Bowing, depending on what culture you're a part of, you bow differently. Depending on who you're talking to you bow to different depths. Handshakes are usually Western, but then if you go through Europe, you've learned that kissing is also part of it. In Chile, it's a half hug and a kiss, as these women are doing in the picture. But then if you go into other nations in South America, it's going to be slightly different. So greetings are a big one. And if you're traveling abroad, I strongly suggest looking at what are the friendly cultural greetings, because it can be surprising if you're not expecting it. And gestures are my other example for you to think about, is the variations in how we use gestures and the nonverbal meaning behind them. So the image I've given you here actually breaks down what these four hand signals mean in different places. And some of them are, quite a few of them are both an insult in some places and very positive in others. So again, take a minute, and what are some other examples of how nonverbal communication expresses cultural identity in your experience? For instance, you could even look at what folks are wearing, right? And the third function of nonverbal communication is that nonverbal communication modifies verbal messages. And I have a list for you of how nonverbal communication modifies verbal. So we have repeating, highlighting, substituting, regulating, and contradicting. So if we have a verbal message, a nonverbal message can repeat it. You say yes and you nod your head. You say, I'm sick, and your nose is running and your face is red and you're sweating, right? Those are examples of nonverbal repeating verbal. Highlighting, think of it as accents. For instance, someone is giving a speech and they pound the podium to make a point, right? So that is highlighting their particular point. Substituting is when we don't use the verbal, we only use the nonverbal. right? Think about being in a room and someone's speaking and someone turns to you and puts their finger over their lips um, and asks you, right? And by doing that, they ask you to be quiet without actually having to say the words. Or somebody shakes their head no and doesn't have to tell you the word no. So we substitute the nonverbal. Regulating happens far more often than we think it does, and this is the idea of how nonverbal communication can control our verbal. So for instance, you're in conversation and you really have something to say, and so you lean forward, you half open your mouth, and you kind of like half move into the conversation. And what you're doing is you're signaling to others that you want to speak, right? And that your turn is coming. The other thing that can happen is I gave the example of someone shushing someone else. We can also use that as regulating, right? So regulating and by quieting someone else and ending their turn to speak. So there are some examples which can work in different situations in various ways to modify verbal messages. So remember that as with most things in communication, not everything is black and white. And then the final one on this list is contradicting, right? So let's say your nose is running and your tears in your eyes and you're obviously physically upset and someone says, "What's wrong?" and you say, "I'm fine." Right? And what's happening there is your verbal message is contradicting your physical nonverbal message that's being sent, right? Because your body can send messages even when you don't symbolically mean them to. So those are the three functions of communication, and now I have several types of communication for you. And I have a list here. I'll talk over them briefly, and I also have a slide for each one giving you some images to try and help get a sense of different ways this might happen. So, physical appearance, how one looks. Artifacts are things. Our clothes, our jewelry, our backpacks, our tools, whatever, right? Hair, you could do an entire class about differences in hair and cultural hair and what that, right, the meanings they're meant to convey and the identity aspects. Kinesics. So if anybody has taken kinesiology classes, kinesiology is the study of movement. So kinesics refers to movement. Every time we make gestures, including with our face, and so eye contact, that's a form of kinesics. Haptics is the act of touch. And we have different types of touch: professional touch, socially polite touch, friendship touch, intimate touch, and sexual touch. Intimate might be, for instance, compared to sexual, your family, very, very close friends, right? So all intimacy is not necessarily sexual. Proxemics, think the word proximity. So this is how people use space, how close they want to be to others, what they do with their territory, how they mark their territory, how close you want people standing to you. Chronemics, so the way to remember this, where the word comes from, Chronos was the god of time, and so chronemics is the use of time. How do you use time? Are you on time? Are you not? Do you claim to not care about time? Olfactics, think olfactory glands, and so this is your smell and scent. Voice. Voice actually is a type of nonverbal communication. So what this is, it's everything except the words themselves. So we call this paralanguage, part of language. Right? So your volume, your tone, the rate, your accent, silence, pauses, right? So everything except the words themselves counts as nonverbal communication. And the environment. We get a lot of meaning from how a room is set up, from the temperature it's set at, from the lighting, right? From the colors you use. If anyone's heard of feng shui, right? That's very much an environmental setup done for particular reasons and to convey different meaning. So, some more specific examples for you. Remember through all of these that there are specific cultural differences. So if I don't necessarily point out a specific cultural heritage, then likely I'm referring to U.S. dominant cultural meanings. So, but here we have an example of how eye contact, personal space, silence, how people are meant to respond to verbals, all of these things are different. So with physical appearance, there's a lot of things going on. Look at history, look at body shapes. There's a ad campaign for Dove women, and they're trying to advocate that different types of bodies are healthy, right? We see a similar one with men down in the bottom corner. Seeing how different folks dress, even at the same event, is actually going on in the top corner. These pictures were all taken of guys going to the exact same event, and the range of styles happening there. Down below, we see how do we convey jobs, right? What are we doing? And what are the artifacts in particular that mark it, right? The stethoscope, the basket of apples, the tools, the suits, all of these pieces. And then I've given you a picture of, it says female unauthorized hairstyles. This was actually put out by the U.S. Army in 2013, I believe. I'm not sure. And they were putting out new guidelines of how women were allowed and not allowed to wear their hair. And they got a lot of backlash for this, and the reason they did is a lot of the hairstyles that they said were unauthorized are hairstyles that women with kind of non-Caucasian, so if you have very, very thick, or if you have very curly or kinky hair, it's actually very difficult to sometimes meet the standards that the Army put into place. And so they caught some backlash because there's a large number of people of color within the U.S. military. Side note, that's actually for economic reasons. It's one of the few ways that people in poorer communities can afford college and can afford housing. So there's large numbers of minorities within the U.S. forces. And so they caught a lot of backlash from saying, here's requirements of how you can and can't wear your hair, which is something they've always done, but the new requirements made it very difficult for some people within minority populations to be able to meet the standards. So physical appearance can have a lot going on. And with each of these, as we talk through, I'll try and show you some basic examples, but I'll also try and demonstrate how we can relate some of these to power. So for instance, how you can and can't wear your hair and some of the social implications of that. Kinesics. So we have here a lot of gestures being made. Remember that facial gestures and eye contact all count. So kinesics is movement. We can see even from turning away, right, from holding your nose, from looking bored. All of these things are kinesics. And when we think about power, this is an actual Dolce & Gabbana ad that was banned, right, because based on the gestures and the movement within the ad, this is a very forceful representation of what looks like sexual assault. And so this ad was pulled, but was initially a real advertisement, right? So we can see how power can be conveyed through kinesics. Haptics is touch, right? So look at the different levels of touch we have happening. We have family, intimacy, friendship, professional touch. And professional touch is going to look different based on the profession and based on the context. I have an image of a baby being touched because what they've actually found is that children, if they do not receive physical touch, often do not thrive. And so in the 1800s in England, there was actually a very high mortality rate for children within orphanages because it was the rule and the standard that they worked, they did not need to be touched. And so children died at very high rates because children need it to thrive, right? We need physical touch within our lives. And then down on the bottom right, we see this image that we saw before, and here we can see touch being used in a way that very much seems to be unwanted, right? And we can see power happening within that situation. Proxemics, how close do we want someone standing? How do we use space? And so I've tried to give you some examples. Intimate zone in the top, friend or intimate zone in the bottom. Right? We see a couple different social and professional zones and audience zone, and you can see how the space increases. I'm not concerned about you knowing the distances that are listed in this diagram, but you should have a sense of why some people are allowed to be closer to us comfortably, right, than others, and what different situations might call for that. It's often a power play if somebody kind of purposefully violates those boundaries which are socially set. But it's also important to remember that different cultures have very different guidelines on proximity and how close you are to one another. And so remember that it might not be intentional, it really might just be cultural practice that someone is standing that close and you're very uncomfortable with it. Chronemics is the use of time. So do you show up on time or are you late? What does it mean to be on time? For you, does on time mean I'm there 10 minutes early? Right? So be aware of how you're defining time versus how others. And the use of time is very culturally based. There are some Latin American cultures that things start when they start, but that also means they end when they end. And that's including things like classes and appointments and meetings, right? So it's a very different take on things than the time is money, you show up, on the dot in the U.S. culture. And up in the top corner, we have a little comic that says he's always late. He says he doesn't like to be kept waiting, right? So as a power play, the person who's in charge can say, you have to be on there on time. I don't want to be kept waiting, so I'm going to show up once you're all there. So chronemics is your use of time and how people interpret it. And olfactics. Olfactics, I can't but help think of teenage boys wearing Axe. And so the very, very strong smells. So the other thing that comes to mind for me when we think of olfactics is I can usually tell when finals week is rolling around because when students are stressed out and have a lot on their plate, some of the personal hygiene pieces are the first ones to go. And so sometimes it's better to maintain a little bit of distance as that time comes around because these olfactics come into play. And so I can smell students that I wouldn't necessarily have been able to smell before, and that tells me you're stressed out, you're busy, and I interpret that as usually being midterms or finals week. And voice. It's very hard to depict paralanguage, but I did find a great chart for you that breaks down some of the non-vocal phenomena that we've talked about, right, and some of the ways these break down, but also tells us different types of the vocal or paralinguistic nonverbals, right? So for instance, your voice type and quality, how you stress things, your intonation, the tempo and rhythm at which you speak, the pauses you include, right? Are you whispering or are you shouting? Laughing, coughing, ums, ahs, all of these are paralinguistic. And people can invoke power, for instance, whispering to make you come close, shouting to convey their power. So we see a lot of different pieces here. Interestingly enough, within the US, the first and second universities featuring journalism were in Missouri and in Kansas. And the reasons for this is the Midwest is often deemed to have the least regional accent, for instance, compared to the slow Southern California or the very slow drawl of the South versus the speedy kind of Brooklyn or New York accents. And so the Midwest was deemed to have the least discernible regional accent, and so they sent newscasters there, or hopeful newscasters, to adjust their accents. The idea being that we gauge people so much, whether on purpose or not, by their accent, that they wanted national broadcasters to have a very neutral way of pronouncing, and that way they would be seen as an authority no matter where they were in the country. Because people often look down on, for instance, a Southern accent because it's slow and calm and relaxed. Some people interpret it as unintelligent, right? And so these often aren't meaningful or on purpose interpretations, but they're ones that researchers have found over time. So the way we say something very much has an impact and is very much a part of nonverbal communication. The environment. Think about how you set up your space. A messy desk versus a clean one, right? What have you chosen to display in your dorm room? What does that say about your identity? What art do you put up in your house? How do you want to focus your space and your time, right? So the environment and its setup, the colors, the heating, the light, all of these pieces, the arrangement can have a very profound impact. And you can actually see in these two cubicle pictures that these are the small cubicles. These are more and more common in what we call a bullpen office setup. And there's a lot of research done as to what's more effective, this bullpen, the taller cubicles, the office setup where everyone actually has walls. So a lot of research goes into how can we set up this environment, particularly for productivity and for collaboration. And so I have just a few quick slides for you, and you can take a pause. I thought you might be interested in common nonverbal mistakes made in job interviews, right? And so you can see it's from a survey of 2,000 bosses. I think it was from 2014. I always take percentages with a grain of salt, right? I wouldn't go around quoting these percentages, but I think it does give you a sense of how much, to what level is this rated important, right? So using too many hand gestures is seen as far less of a downside than failing to make eye contact. However, remember that eye contact is very culturally based. It's important in US dominant culture, whereas there's a lot of Asian cultures where eye contact is not something you want to do, right? So take a minute, pause it, check it out. I'm curious what you think of what they found compared to your experiences either being hired or hiring. And then this last slide, we've talked about verbal communication. We've talked about nonverbal communication. I think it's useful for you to have a little bit of a comparison chart. So feel free, take a few minutes, read it through, and you'll see that it touches on points that we've already talked about across both chapters, but sometimes it's useful to see things in column format. So hopefully this gives you a better sense of the reasons and the functions of nonverbal communication, but also the types of nonverbal communication and what is nonverbal overall.